Okay, so I did some experimentation with the Apple Watch tracking. Had a bunch of ideas. I had the idea of just having a solid color on the screen, and then I had used an app I had. So I had this VFX app specifically made for adding green screens and tracking markers to an Apple Watch, and uh, it's a good idea, but it's just I don't think it really works well for a number of reasons. Biggest problem is obviously Apple has this rule that you always have to show the time on the screen if your app is on the screen. So it kind of limits the usefulness of this kind of screen tracker, because then you got this freaking time you have to paint out. So that alone is kind of a deal breaker. And also having the tracking markers on the screen generated by the app itself is not quite as useful as with the Apple Watch, especially because it's just so reflection and glare happy, right? So I kind of canned that idea after testing it. Ultimately, what I came up with is this. So I cut out little pieces of orange gaffer tape, and then taped it to the face of the Apple Watch. So what that gives you is it gives you reliable tracking markers, even though there's a lot of reflection on the screen, but because they're non-reflective, you can see that Mocha can still track them. In fact, let's see. So normally when you do a planar track, you just kind of track the entire face, but because of all these reflections that are going on the face of the screen, Mocha pretty much will barf on if you just try to track the entire screen itself. So what you can do is have it track multiple tracking references on the same plane. And the way you do that is to see I've got a single layer, but then there's this X plus, which adds more splines to the same layer. So I just added splines around each of these little pieces of tape, tracked the perspective of it, and that's how I was able to generate a reliable surface for the face of the watch. So even though there's a ton of reflections going on, I was still able to get a good track. So in principle, that works great. So when I recorded this test, that was obviously just kind of a rough idea I had. As I did this kind of test comp here, you can see, well, let me show you what happened when I, so obviously the problem with this is getting rid of the tracking markers. So one trick I like to do is when I generate the tracking data for the face of the watch or the phone or anything for that matter that might have tracking markers I need to remove, or if I need to do anything else with the clean up the screen or whatever, I will use the tracking data from Mocha. So that's my track layer, and I told the Mocha plugin to track that, and then I'll bring it in. I'll load up Mocha Import Plus, load that tracking data that was created by the Mocha plugin, and then instead of doing a corner pen, I tell Mocha Import Plus to create a stabilized pre-comp based on that tracking data. So what that will give me is this in a pre-comp. It'll basically give me a pre-comp of the watch face completely stabilized. So you can see. So my initial inclination was to, so I've got, I have a little mask there. I would just kind of subtract it and then do an offset underneath it. And you do the old trick of doing a kind of a keyhole cut in the foreground, and you just offset the same layer through the keyhole. But in this case, it didn't really work for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, is that the reflection is just so dynamic, and it's so organic, I should say, and dynamic. It's hard to kind of just offset it and have everything match. You can see right there what's going on. The bigger problem, the reason why that's a bigger problem is because my tracking markers are too big. What I should have done is make them at even half of that. That way there's less stuff I need to try to clone in. But I think even then it probably would have been a problem. By the way, when I set up these tracking markers, what I instruct people to do is make the tracking markers kind of random, semi-random. In fact, let me, a shape like that. It doesn't have to be a perfect cross. In fact, it's better not for it to be a cross. It's better for it to be, just like that. It's kind of a geometric shape, because when the face goes off in perspective, Mocha will have an easier time tracking it if it has a kind of a unique shape instead of just a cross or something. And you just kind of randomly put it on the face. But yeah, the tracking markers are way too big. So that really makes it a problem to remove it. So I couldn't really remove it using my standard offset technique. So if I had to do this again, what I would do is make the tracking markers even smaller than this. And the other problem is that the tracking markers are they're too far in on the face of the watch. They really should be more farther out here. And the reason why that is that one cool trick that I like to do is I'll take this stabilized screen, right? So, and if I had tracking markers over here, what I would do is take the stabilized layer and then scale it up. Scale it up so why don't I just do that here? So scale it up so the tracking markers kind of leave the screen. But in this case, because the tracking markers are so far in, I have to really scale this sucker up in order to do that. In this case, it might be good. That might be okay. But there are going to be some times when that's going to be way too much scale. So if I had the tracking markers over here in the corner, I wouldn't have to scale as much to get it off screen. And I also have a track mat to kind of hold that scaling out. But that would be the better way to remove the tracking markers. So if you go back to here, okay, and then I'll just put my insert layer over it. And you can see a little bit of remnant of my tracking marker there, but this is obviously a rough test. And so you can see now that you get in the reflections and a pretty solid track. And in this case, we probably could get away with scaling up that stabilized layer to get rid of the tracking markers. It's pretty extreme scale, but you could get away with it. Obviously, the reflections you're seeing there are kind of maybe too distracting, but if we could make it work if that was the situation we had. But obviously, the more ideal setup would be for those tracking markers to be as close as possible to the edge, so we only have to scale up ever so slightly just to get the tracking markers out. So that's really the better way to get rid of the on-screen markers for these kind of screen replacements, because then you don't have to worry about offsets and making sure that you can clone in the patch. So, and I did try, here's a test I did with, so I had this version of the test where this is just a red screen from the Apple Watch flashlight, gives you a red full screen thing. I couldn't really figure out how to get a green screen on there, but this is just to test it. But I think the results would be the same. But what happened was, see, if I composited the insert over that, obviously I would have to desat the color in the screen, which is usually not a big deal. But in this case, because of the color I chose, see, and I've desatted it here using Lumetri hue sat curves. Obviously, it's also getting desaturating everything else around it, but just for test purposes. But you can see the brightness of the screen it kind of compromises the way that the screen insert screens over with the screen blend mode. It looks washed out. So then you have to do an additional thing where you got to use curves and levels to kind of bring the contrast of the insert down. But then it becomes a little more complicated because when you do that, you're actually affecting. You can't see well. Let's bring up the exposure there. You're also anything you either have to precisely roto the screen out, which would kind of a pain in the butt, or you just kind of have a rough garbage mat like I have here. See, and then you just apply your color correction to it. But the problem is, in order to pull that contrast down from where it was here, say, turn that off. It's going to mess with the black, the black bezel, and that stuff will bleed through here. You can kind of see, if you look closely, you can see. So obviously the black levels now don't really match the actual watch. So, I mean, you can obviously color correct that and fix it, but it just adds way more complication to what should otherwise be a simple screen replacement. So my initial thoughts of using even if this was a green screen, I think you'd have the similar issues of, even if you desaturated the screen still does not have a lot of contrast. So you really want something that's dark and black with white highlights to get a nice clean composite like you see in here, right? Because this is black. So that really gives you nice screen reflections. So in the end, I think the best plan is to shoot the watch with a black screen with these non-reflective tracking markers, basically gaffer's tape. Something, if you can get a color like this that has good contrast, that's even better. But make the markers smaller while still kind of keeping this kind of randomly geometric shape, but make them smaller, and then bring the tracking markers out to as close to the corners as possible without actually crossing the corners. You don't want to cross this edge here, but it would probably be smaller and right over there. And that way we can use that to track in Mocha and then stabilize the screen and then scale it up to remove the tracking markers. And then you get a nice clean screen track. So that should do it. I hope this doesn't come to bite me in the ass, but I think this will work. So hope this helps.